You are about to listen to the full interview with John B. Buescher. Sections of it were originally included in our John Murray Spear episode. John B. Buescher is the author of The Remarkable Life of John Murray Spear, agitator for the Spiritland. We dig deeper into John's early life and more wild experiments we didn't have time for in the episode. We hope you enjoy.
My name is John Buescher, and I'm a retired academic researcher. My primary field of research is 19th century American spiritualism. I first became interested in that subject after I had finished my graduate work studying Asian religions. And I wondered at that time, who was it that first became interested in Asian religions in the West, and why did they become interested? So I was led to look into the sources, and it was clear to me that those first people were folks like Henry David Thoreau and Emerson, transcendentalists from New England, who were sitting around reading the Bhagavad Gita and somehow looking for sources of wisdom there. But among them, also seated next to them in these lectures and discussion sections, were spiritualists. And I didn't really know anything about who the spiritualists were. But as I started to look into them, it became clear to me that these people were the real fire engines to this interest in Asian religions. And they were real characters in and of themselves. So I've always been interested in doing history as a series of biographies. I don't really know how to do history any other way. So I've been writing biographies of spiritualists ever since then, just because they're such fascinating folks. And I must say that when on my first pass through the history of American spiritualism, when I turned to the story of John Murray Spear, who's given a lot of attention in some of the histories of early spiritualism, American spiritualism, I just couldn't believe what I was reading about his projects and what he was doing. It seemed to me like, wow, the 19th century was a whole lot stranger than what I had ever been led to believe. This guy seemed to me to have invented steampunk science fiction, even if it's possible to have invented steampunk back in the 1850s. It just seemed incredible what he was trying to do. So that's how I first latched on to him, and was interested that nobody had written on him before much. And as I turned into the sources and put things together, his life just seemed more and more incredible to me.
Oh, I agree. When we first came on this story, it sounded unbelievable, and just from what was on the internet, and then once I dug into your book, it was so much more fascinating than I even thought it was to begin with.
When I first started thinking about writing a book on him, I thought, oh wow, this is the stuff of science fiction. And I contemplated trying to write it as a novel, but actually part of the wonderment of this is that it wasn't science fiction. So I decided to write it straight history and not, exaggerate anything that I couldn't find in the sources, but just tell it straight. And I think that, in fact, by doing that, his story is stranger.
Oh, I think that if you did it as a novel, there would be so many things that people would think is a stretch to get to. Having it documented the way you did, it really is mind-blowing. Like everything that he did throughout his life. So getting into that, who was John Murray Spear? Especially like his early life, his involvement in the Universalist Church, abolitionism.
Well, John Murray Spear was born in Boston. I think his father was a fisherman, as I recall. A pretty poor family. He had an older brother, Charles, who had been born a year before him in 1804. John Murray Spear was born. And his parents had become members of a congregation of the preacher who first preached universal salvation in the United States. His name was John Murray, and he had a church in Boston. And John Murray Spear was christened by Reverend John Murray, and of course was given his name by his parents. The Universalists were in the midst of a tremendous growth during that time, inspired by John Murray. I think the peak of that growth of universalism was probably around 1820, and it spread out all over New England and then into the western portions of what was then the United States. So there were many, many Universalists, and they were concerned with their inherited Calvinist notion that the Calvinist atmosphere of the time was that very dark and regarding people's eternal salvation. John Murray and the Universalists proclaimed that, in fact, everyone would be saved, universal salvation. That distinguished them from the rest of the denominations that they were surrounded by. But it was taken as a liberation of sorts, this notion of universal salvation. And in the midst of what you would call the decay of Calvinism in New England, it was part of an entire change of attitude towards not only the next world, but this world as well. So that was what Universalism was. John grew up in that environment, and he was early trained as sent out to apprentice and became a shoemaker, which was not automated at the time like it became during his lifetime. There were still cobblers who made each person made their individual entire shoe from the beginning. His brother Charles was apprenticed to a printing operation and became a printer himself.
And the shoemakers at the time, they were like thinkers, correct? They were very educated people.
The shoemakers were typically regarded as being well-read. I think that comes from the fact that the shoemaking shops would try to while away the hours by having all the shoemakers in the shop be read to, a little bit like monks in a monastery during meals, always having somebody to read something because silence was required. And in the same way, they just read constantly to each other. And not only did they have a reputation for being well-read and up on things, but they were also regarded as a nest of social radicals, in the sense that the labor movement began primarily among shoemakers in New England. The first labor strikes were among shoemakers in Massachusetts during that time. So they were up on the news constantly. They were well read. John was obviously up on the news, and although he didn't really have much of a formal education, same with his brother. Obviously, you have to be well-read to be a printer's apprentice, and they both spent most of their early childhood in rather impoverished circumstances, and but hard at work, at improving themselves and their education. But they were self-educated, essentially.
Right. And then, so what happens to John after he is a apprentice for the shoemakers?
Well, his brother first decided to study such as he could do for the Universalist ministry, and started that, and convinced his brother as well to start. So John Murray Spear started studying for that, and was taken into fellowship with the Universalists and became a minister. And they both served ministries throughout Massachusetts, eastern Massachusetts. Especially John went to Barnstable out on the Cape, and his brother was stationed in various places, also north of Boston and so on. So they were both Universalist ministers by the time they were young men and moving from congregation to congregation. John eventually wound up as the Universalist minister in New Bedford, and built the first Universalist church there. It was the one that Frederick Douglass wound up associating himself with, at least informally, after he had made his way north, having escaped slavery. So John and Frederick Douglass were close acquaintances at the time that happened.
John was,
although I think Frederick Douglass,
correct?
Yes, and as part of it was common for Universalists to be regarded as extreme liberals, or as they said, progressives, in social matters. So John took up all of those progressive reforms of the time, and that included abolitionism, and would later include women's rights and prison reform, the abolition of the death penalty, temperance movement, and everything else basically that came his way. Both he and Charles were progressives in that sense.
Were they?
John was.
Were they even, in terms of the Universalist Church, were they pretty in the mainstream in their beliefs, or were they even out on the fringe of that for what progressives were?
Well, John was very, I'm not quite sure what to say. He was pretty energetic, and you could both he and his brother were in a state of mind where, having thrown off the shackles of the old theology, as they called Calvinism, were prepared to rely on their own leanings, as they thought of this, as spiritual light that would lead them into new reforms and whatever the age demanded. So their business, in a sense, was to liberate people from all kinds of societal restrictions and shackles. That was how John became quite active in the abolitionist movement in particular. He was a well-regarded workhorse for the New England Anti-Slavery Society, Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. He was a lecturer and a traveling lecturer for them and paid for that. And doing that, he wandered all over New England, giving lectures, abolitionist lectures. He worked closely with William Lloyd Garrison. They were very close, and the other abolitionists at the time.
Yeah, and his lectures kind of led to some harassments, and there was an incident, Christmas 1844, when he was giving a lecture, where he was basically beaten close to death. Can you tell us more about that?
Well, he, again, on one of these lecture tours by the Abolitionist Society in Boston, he wound up in Maine, in Portland, Maine, and was on the platform giving lecture there with another abolitionist, Stephen Simons Foster. And it was not the case that everyone in New England was naturally an abolitionist for various reasons. And they found themselves in these lectures typically facing a mixed reception. And that was common for all the lecturers. Anyway, at this particular one, after the lecture, as John was leaving the church or town hall where he was giving it, he was set on by a group of men who were obviously not in tune with his thoughts on this, and was beaten and dragged himself across the street through the mob, and was finally rescued and brought into the house of a sympathizer, and was fell into a coma that lasted for a few days before he finally came out of it. But it took him a long time to recover. He was beaten about the head, and when he came out of the coma, he seems to have been visited by spirits, perhaps. He wasn't sure of what happened, but in any event, he was, I think you might say, a different person, more
right. That was kind of his first experience with spirits, correct?
Yeah. He wasn't quite clear on that, but it did. I think in retrospect, you can see that he was not so worldly attuned after that. He was more tuned towards toward what was happening in his head, basically.
Right. Because not too long after that, he writes in The Prisoner's Friend this review of this book by Andrew Jackson Davis, Principles of Nature, Her Revelations, and a Voice to Mankind. Can you talk about what he wrote about that book and how did it affect John Murray Spear? Because it seemed to really have a profound effect on him.
Well, he was at that time editing a periodical that his brother Charles really took over and was the main editor of, and they had one of their most particular projects of reform was the abolition of the death penalty and the improvement of prison conditions. And in that periodical, John reviewed books. And one of the books he wrote a review of was this book by Andrew Jackson Davis. That book was written down by Jackson Davis's close associate, who was also a Universalist minister. Davis had dictated these discourses while in trance about the nature of the universe. Apparently he believed, and so did his close associates, that these were being dictated to him by the spirit of Emanuel Swedenborg. The book itself was a sort of cosmic revelation of the past and future, and described realms of visionary places where spirits dwelt. Something like Emanuel Swedenborg himself, whose writings describe him visiting places like Saturn or various realms of spirit land. This is what Davis's book was like. And when it was published in 1847, it created a huge sensation. It wasn't just Speer who was deeply inspired by it as a totally new cosmological revelation, but he was certainly one of the ones who was inspired by it. I think his reaction was different from the other reformers who he was hanging with. You can see throughout Speer's life at this time that he was starting to move away from being totally focused on particular reform movements like abolitionism and women's rights and prison reform. He was no longer so focused on being one of the active leaders. He was more inclined to leave that sort of hard grit work that his colleagues had depended on him for, and be more concerned with something that he felt was more theoretical but deeper, sort of visionary world. So the other folks that he was hanging out with, like William Lloyd Garrison and so on, they were certainly aware of this sort of tension between people who were really in it to work for their causes, as opposed to people who seemed to be drifting off into contacting the other world. This is really a big issue in the reform community back in those days.
So around this time is when spiritualism starts taking off, correct, in America?
Yes, as a self-defined movement.
So what was the beginning of spiritualism, and kind of what is spiritualism?
Well, spiritualism, as it crystallized by its followers in a bit of a retrospective way, it began in March 1848 when two sisters, whose last name was Fox, they began hearing raps in the night, rapping, sounds of rappings. And what turned this from something that was like any ghost story into something that was a little different was that in the sisters' presence, they could send and receive through rappings, using it as a sort of code, messages from the spirit who would talk to them and give them answers to questions. So this was something that was new, a little new. And it was following not too long after the first enthusiasm over the electronic telegraph, which had been such a success starting in 1845. So part of the excitement about this, and the reason it spread like wildfire from them, was that it seemed to people at the time to be something like an opening of a spiritual telegraph between spirits in the afterlife and those of us still here in mortal flesh. That was something new, and people were prepared to be excited not only because the electronic telegraph had been something that was seemingly so miraculous, so people were open to the possibility that maybe something like this had begun, intercourse between earth and heaven, but also because it was something different and progressive in the sense that here was something that was a sort of religion that was based on empiricism. It seemed like, hey, not only do we have physical evidence for this sort of communication, here are the sounds, the rappings, the responses, and so on. But also, it was something that was sort of ultra-democratic. You could do it and perform experiments with it on your own kitchen table. And you could sort of do your own theology around what the spirits told you.
Is that what attracted John Murray Spear to it? Because I know he kind of started getting into it through mesmeric trance, correct?
Yes. Well, by that time, the interest that had begun earlier in developing and experimenting with mesmerism, or what we would call hypnotism today, had also spread around New England. And there were plenty of people within the progressive movement who turned themselves into experimenters, experts, lecturers, performers of mesmeric trance. Andrew Jackson Davis, actually, although he was later associated closely with the spiritualist movement per se, was discovered and made famous at the beginning by his ability to go into, to be entranced and to seemingly be able to see into people's bodies and diagnose their hidden ills, sort of like an X-ray machine. Excuse me, just a...
Did it work?
Well, RJ, I don't know what to tell you. There was conflicting evidence. There was conflicting testimony about that.
Yeah.
Anyway, the claim about mesmerism was that you could turn yourself into a seer through developing yourself as a mesmeric subject. So the subject of trance was a sort of fit logically together in the reformer's mind with the notion that now we were on our own and each one of us could find the light of truth and illumination within us through visionary experiences. So it was something that reformers practiced. John Murray Spear didn't necessarily turn himself into a mesmeric subject or operator along the lines that were that other people were doing, but it was in the same atmosphere. And certainly the notion that a truly religious experience was one that was an interior experience where you were open to getting affected by a spiritual reality that you couldn't see was certainly congruent with what he was, thinking himself at the time.
Right. And then in March 1852, John began being a medium. Correct? Yes?
Yes.
And can you tell us what happened then in the story of kind of the next few days? Because I know he a bunch of messages came to him.
Okay, my memory's an aged one. So what is this subject referring to?
I think this is kind of the first time, what I'm trying to get to is the first time that he started communicating with the Association of Beneficents.
Well, he had been practicing what was later called automatic writing, where it's a little bit like a Ouija board, but you take a pencil in your hand and wait for it to move by itself. It takes practice from most people, and some people it never happened. But it did with him, and he began receiving such written messages that he believed did not come from anywhere in him for some period, and developed that, fell into it more and more, and he began getting messages from a group of spirits who identified themselves as what they called the Association of Beneficence. And it turned out that, according to these messages, they were some selected and highly noble group of departed spirits who had decided now that this spiritual telegraph had opened up between the afterlife and the mortal life, to gather together and deliver messages to the people of this world. And they were folks like Benjamin Franklin, Daniel Webster, Thomas Paine, Manuel Swedenborg, John Hancock, Seneca.
Yeah, some of the greatest minds.
Some of the greatest minds. They were now at leisure and had the power to communicate. And they formed an association that reminds me very much of what you might expect a sort of New England town meeting would produce as a ad hoc committees and so on.
Yeah.
And they had decided to break up this reformatory work, spirits reformatory work for the world, into committees. And they were named, I think there were 6, and they had named themselves, these committees had named themselves the Electricizers, the Elementizers, the Educationizers, the Governmentizers, the Healthfulizers, and the Agriculturalizers. These are like cabinet positions, I suppose.
Right.
But each of these groups would devote themselves to delivering messages on reform projects and theories to the world. And they had decided to make John Murray Spear the main communicator, the main medium, their main wire to the world.
Right. And then a few months after he began receiving these messages, I believe it was the spirit of Benjamin Franklin is what John Murray Spear said gave him a message about the new motor. What is the new motor?
Benjamin Franklin was apparently the head of the Electricizers. Not surprising given his experiments when he was on Earth. And
he and the kite.
Right, the kite, yeah, all that. So he had decided to reveal a major project to John Murray Spear and his little group of followers. Now, John Murray Spear had followers who had decided to participate in these projects. And they were consecrated with various names, and the one who was John Murray Spear's main associate on this project, anyway, was named Simon Crosby Hewitt, also a Universalist minister, but a labor organizer, and he was also a trained mechanic. I think he worked in textile mills before. So he did, in fact, have some mechanical skills as a machinist and, general mechanic. So it was to Simon Crosby Hewitt and a few other followers. And I must say, mostly these were, John Murray Spear's followers were heavily salted with folks who had some money. In particular, there were 3 or 4 patrons that became close associates with Spear that were well endowed. And that probably explains something about the way Spear worked and his ability to conduct some of these projects. John himself,
well, yeah.
Right. John himself had no abilities in electrical work or mechanical work, apart from having been a shoemaker. But Hewitt did. I don't know how much he knew about electricity. Maybe not so much, but maybe not many people knew much about electricity. But it was the coming thing at the time. There were new electrical devices that were being invented and brought online, and despite the fact that nobody really knew what electricity was, people were inventing devices that could use it in various ways, as signaling devices and so on. So the project that the Spear to Benjamin Franklin began dictating plans to John Murray Spear for was called the New Motor, or at the beginning, the New Motive Power. It was a phrase that was used for other projects, non-spiritual projects, but steam engines and new sources of energy. People were experimenting and developing new kinds of new motors, but this new motor was going to be something different. Now, exactly what it was unclear at the beginning, and indeed never really came together, but it was more like, the idea of this is that, for one thing, it would be self-powered. And metaphysically speaking, you might say that was important to reformers because they were convinced that people themselves had to become self-powered and sovereign individuals and not slaves or bound to any earthly power. In addition,
interesting.
In addition,
so does the self-powered, does it necessarily refer to it being a mechanism that doesn't need, well, for lack of a better phrase, any power, versus a mechanism that was free to do whatever it wanted or needed to? What was the idea there? Because that is something that I've been, just the phrasing is a little obtuse, I guess, and maybe they didn't really know either at the time, it sounds like.
Exactly. I think you're onto something. It was pregnant with possibilities, the phrase was. So you were free to imagine it in either way, I think. In addition, you were also free to imagine the new motive power as referring to people. Here was something that, people needed a new motive. Society needed a new motive for existence.
Right. Sure.
It was no longer, the old institutions and arrangements were no longer functioning. So society itself needed a new motive for acting.
Yeah, something new to drive society forward, because everything else is kind of failing around that time. Yeah,
but since it was one of the possibilities to think about this thing was that it was self-powered, meant that if it was self-powered, we were talking about creating a perpetual motion machine. So It wouldn't.
So a machine that's just always moving by itself.
It was always moving, and by itself, it didn't need to be energized by any material or means, or it would just keep going. It would go of itself, and it would always be going of itself. So that was certainly one of the ideas that was driving what this machine was supposed to be able to accomplish. But it was also something else there, which was that it would continue to go by itself, and it was like an ideal that was in the heads of these folks who were building this machine, and day by day learning more about it as they were given instructions on its building, that this was something that was a sort of model of what the human would be in the future. It was a new man. It was going to be called the electrical infant, God's last best gift to mankind. And they began perceiving each of these parts that were being described as, parts of analogous to the parts of the human body. So yes, they were also constructing an automaton in their minds.
Right. I think some people thought it was kind of going to be a new Messiah. Is that correct?
It was going to be the new Messiah, because it would do any number of things that were problematic to folks at that time. It would unite heaven and earth. It would make people less dependent on the merely material world, where you had to harness up the power from horses or from water power or something. It would free labor, because energy was going to be free. It would be the model for the way people's lives could be constructed, reformed and turned into something where people were no longer enslaved to mechanical means. It was to be any number of things, and all of those things accumulated. All those ideas accumulated around this mysterious thing that they were being instructed to build. The thing, it's like back engineering something where you're blindly being told what to build, but you don't quite know what it is that you're building, and you have to infer what the function of this machine is and what its possibilities are, only at the end when you can finally see it working.
So did they think that this would be something... it sounds like what you're saying is they thought that this would be something that was both practical, in that it would be an actual mechanism, almost, I don't know, like a car motor or something, except for a car motor requires gas. It wouldn't require that, where you could install this and it would free everybody up and be able to push technology forward, while at the same time being this ideal that would then let your mind be able to be free from thinking about those obstacles in your life, to be able to better connect with the world. Is that kind of what the thought was?
Exactly. All of that and more, man. It was going to do everything. And not only that, you mentioned about, would it walk around? Well, there was one artist, painter, who was a spiritualist and knew John. His name was Josiah Walcott, and he had a vision about the new motor. And in his vision, this is while they were still working on it, putting it together. In his vision, the new motor grew and started walking across the landscape, And as it walked, it threw off smaller versions of itself, replicating itself into new motors. And these would be marching across the landscape and stepping on and destroying the old cultural artifacts, the churches, and all of this, and spreading out like it reminds me really a lot of the descriptions of H.G. Wells in the War of the Worlds, where
the tripods,
setting up and replicating and so on. This is and I have had some notions that H.G. Wells, in my fantasy here, got hold of a copy of John Murray Spears' collected spirit discourses called The Educator, in which a lot of his projects were described, and was familiar with it, but I can't say that that's anything more than my own fancy. But
it does sound like it would look almost something like H.G. Wells' like Time Machine, something like that. And to that idea, can you tell us about kind of where was this built? What was the you've kind of told us the process of getting the instructions, but what was the process of building it, and where was it done, and that kind of stuff?
I think, as I recall, John started getting these instructions while he was living in Boston, or just north of Boston, in the city of Lynn, Massachusetts. And this is in 1853 or so. And just before that time, one of his friends who had been heavily involved in the early days of spiritualism, which this was, who was named Jesse Hutchinson, had built a big, what he called a cottage, but it was much more extensive than that, and what the name implies, on a high bluff on one side of Lynn called High Rock, and this thing had an observatory tower attached to it, so it would look out over the bay where Lynn was. And Andrew Jackson Davis had spent some weeks there in High Rock Tower, and had a vision of the spirits coming down from heaven, the various nationalities of spirits parading down out of the sky into the tower, and giving him a series of messages there. And not long after that, John and his little group of followers moved into that place, High Rock Tower. They built.
It kind of sounds like Frankenstein's tower from the original movie.
Well, like the high place where you would, some mad scientist would look for lightning strikes to power his new man and raise his Frankenstein monster.
Yeah,
very much,
totally.
Very much so. I think it was high, and so it was thought to be a place that was close to the heavens and had purified airs around it. It was said to be self-powered, and that's true, but there was some portion of this machine that was to have aerials that stretched up and pointed into the sky. So it was supposed to collect electricity somehow out of the sky and then channel it into the machine. That was actually to be the source of power. In John's...
Right. Was it electricity, or was it just kind of the general energy of the world?
I think it was just like the general energy of the world. Something like, in John's spirit explanations for the way this worked was that there was constantly energy pouring out of the North Pole, and you could see it in the Aurora Borealis, and it circled down south and around the globe. And this etheric energy atmosphere could be collected and was, in fact, as the Spirit said, collected by human beings by their hair. It's odd, but this was the reason why John and his male followers all let their hair grow. They had long hair from this point because it would make them more attuned to this etheric energy, you see. So these aerials that were pointing up out of the machine were there to collect this energy. Now, the machine was built out of, regular machine parts, brass, steel, iron, and it was described slowly over some months. So they didn't quite know what they were doing as they were being given the directions, but were building it up piece by piece. It was set up on a very massive wooden table at the top of High Rock Tower in that room, the observatory room. And on that wooden table, there was a metal platform. We don't have any pictures of this thing. We have descriptions of how the thing was built and what it looked like that were published by this group in Simon Crosby Hewitt's newspaper that he published for the crowd. The newspaper was called The New Era. We have 2 segments out of 3 of his complete descriptions, so we can't know exactly what it looked like, but we know a lot about it. It had, one of its features was it had an armature that was supposed to rotate once it finally started going, and this armature had some little steel balls attached to it that hung down from it. And I don't really know what these steel balls were supposed to do, except they were supposed to be evidence that the thing was going and was alive then. It had started. So once those steel balls were attached, of course, everyone was waiting to see when they would start rotating.
So those were kind of attached last, like as it was getting completed?
Yeah, like that. I don't know exactly when in the process they were attached, but we don't have the original of the instructions. These were all taken down. John would be in trance and would dictate the instructions he was receiving day by day to his followers, and they would take it down, and then they would make the necessary adjustments. So it was like, hey, we've got Benjamin Franklin on the phone, sort of, and he's telling us what to do next. So the thing kind of built itself up and accreted slowly over time. One part was added one day, another part was added another day, then another part was, oh, well, you didn't do that right. You have to attach something else to that. And it was trial. Well, I don't want to call it trial and error, but there were plenty of things that weren't clear when the instructions were first given.
Yeah, plenty of error.
Well, it was building to some climax for sure.
So it was built, like parts of it were meant to mirror functions in the human body, correct?
Yes, at least theoretically. The machine was meant to be some new human, in a way, whatever that meant. And so the aerials were the hair, human hair, and then, I don't know, there were arms of some sort. But some of this was, I don't know quite exactly how to think about whether or not these were just allegorical correspondences or whether or not the parts were really made to look like a human body. In fact, I kind of think that it didn't look much like a human body, but it was symmetrical. It had parts that were assigned as corresponding to different parts of the human body and so on. I have a notion that it kind of looked like the lunar lander, but maybe with exposed parts like this armature that was supposed to rotate, and parts that were meant to work like a motor. Like if you took the casing off of a mechanical motor, and you could see the parts moving inside. It was, it didn't need a casing as such. So maybe you could see it like that, or maybe it...
Yeah, there was no casing around it?
Yeah, no casing. With aerials, of course, poking up. But it was, I think it was probably squat. In a way, it would look to us like something squat, like a lunar lander.
How big was it?
How what?
Big? Like, what was the size of it?
I don't know. Exactly. Maybe like a VW Bug, but maybe smaller than that.
Oh,
maybe
wow.
Smaller than that.
Wow. That's a lot bigger than I was thinking it was.
Yeah, fairly sizable. But I mean, it was put on a wooden table and, so it couldn't have been weighing tons or anything.
At some point it gets completed, right? And then what happens when they complete it?
Well, it seemed to be completed. And then they spent a lot of days thinking, well, maybe we didn't do this quite right or that quite right. It hadn't started yet. So, maybe we should go polish these steel balls or something. So they spent some time doing those sorts of things. And, under high expectation, and the word had got out in the community, so everybody knew that this was happening. So people were waiting for something to happen, and it didn't happen. Jackson Davis visited it one day and thought, oh, this is really interesting, but, it really wasn't moving, so what's the payoff here? Some people had noted that there was some small movement of these suspended steel balls, but they were attributing that to static electricity in the air. But basically, the big armature was not turning. So the spirits, or John really, decided that it needed some kind of jump start, that's what was wrong. It needed some kind of influx of spiritual energy. So he was figuring out a way to try to do that, and constructed himself a sort of armored suit. I think these were made of plates of metal, maybe zinc and copper or something, that were strung around him. And, again, he's got some simple idea that he could attract etheric energy to himself and hold it in himself like a battery, accumulate it like a Leyden jar, and then translate it into the machine. So what we have is descriptions of him walking towards the machine, having himself gotten all juiced up, and then, as it's described in the newspaper account by his colleague Hewitt, an umbilicus of etheric energy was transmitted between John and the machine. There's some language in that description that suggests that we're talking about some kind of ritualized sexual encounter, but that's very difficult to picture a 19th century mechanic writing for the public in a newspaper, describing in much detail, the sort of detail that you'd like to have. So we have to leave that to our imagination, exactly what they thought was going on in this transmission. But at the same time, or nearly the same time, another of John's followers, whose name was Sarah Newton, she was also a medium, and she had become convinced that she was going to become the mother of the new motor, of the electrical infant. And
why was she convinced of this?
She was a medium, and she also received messages. And since she was part of this group, and I think you could say because they were all waiting for something to happen and not sure what they were lacking yet, this was the answer that came. She found herself, as a result of this series of messages, or convinced that she was experiencing labor pains, and she was moved north of Boston. She was living in Boston at the time, north of Boston to Lynn, where she came into close proximity, as it were, or as it was described, to the machine. And after that, there was joy and jubilation all around, because this group proclaimed to the world that the machine had moved. It was, starting to move. But what can you say? It was the movement was apparent only to the followers. Whether or not it was.
When did it start to move?
Well, after she came in contact with it, is all I could say.
What? Yeah, can you describe that? Because I know that in your book you mentioned that they said that there needed to be both a male and a female energy and a feminine energy to basically kind of give birth to the new motor, the new motive power.
Right. Well, like with humans, you need the male and the female. So John had infused it with a male energy, and Sarah had, by her proximity, somehow infused it with the female. And so thus the electrical infant was born and would move. And
there was there's no description of what that physical proximity was?
No, again, we're talking about 19th century newspaper reporting. Yeah. So such matters were somewhat delicate, and I'm sure... I'm sure it was thought to be, none of y'all's business exactly what was going on here. But anyway, contact was made. So allegedly, yes, the announcement was made. It's moving. Yeah.
The followers, what did they think was moving on it?
Well, they thought that this grand armature that the steel balls were attached to was supposed to start rotating, and that was going to be...
So it was starting to rotate.
Yeah, started to rotate. It would sort of be, in this respect, it was supposed to be like a generator. You've got the armature and it moves, and then you get power out of that. You connect to it. So this is how it was going to provide free power, among the other things. But you can't really pin these things down because, as we've noted, a lot of different notions and ideas were accreted to this machine as it was being built, this contraption. What it was going to do, how it was going to be providing free energy for everyone, how it was going to go on forever, how it was to create a model, an ideal for human society and for individual humans. All of this stuff was just kind of floating around in their heads. So One of the ideas was something on the order of this would be a kind of electrical, like an electric motor, that you could attach parts to, and it would drive other motors, presumably agricultural implements and all kinds of other stuff. So this was the basic way it was that they fixated on by the time it was complete, that it was going to be the sign that the thing was alive that this armature would go to.
But then they decide, or they're given the message that it's not, it's just a baby, and that they need to build a kind of womb for it.
Yeah, well, again, here's further, the further development was that when outsiders came to look at it, the thing wasn't moving. So tell me how this thing is working, they would say. Well, it did move. Maybe you can imagine saying, well, it did move. We did get movement, but it's not working now. And I don't know what's exactly going on. But we did have initial movement. So we're making progress here, and just give us a little more time and we'll improve it, and it'll really start pumping away here. So it was always a struggle to figure out what to do with this thing next, what adjustments to make, what was going to improve it to the eyes of the outside world and make it really effective. So I don't know what kind of movement they got out of it at the beginning. Frankly, nobody knows. But it wasn't moving upon further examination. So what they decided was, well, okay, what's missing here? Well, it's just newborn, so it somehow needs to be nourished and protected the way a newborn is. It needs to be further matured before it can really take on its own and do what it's supposed to do. So like a mother's womb, or like swaddling that a mother gives to her infant after it's born, it needs to be nurtured more. And I don't know exactly what that consisted of. It certainly consisted of something like purifying the environment around it. And I think that was part of what was going on in their minds when they decided to move the thing. They disassembled it and took it out to Randolph, New York, where one of the followers had a big farm. And they reassembled it there. And that would be, a more private place for experimentation or whatever. And tried to continue to work on it. I think that's what are called the wombomic processes that they were trying to struggle through with understanding, was to nurture it, protect it, and make it stronger that way.
So, John, you're saying that a lot of this information comes from the newspapers and stuff around then. Now, we have this now. What did people who weren't part of the spiritualist movement, who weren't part of this, what was the outside reaction to this project?
Well, it was a mix, but mostly it was something like, okay, here's blasphemy going on in High Rock, trying to create a new race of human beings, messing with the Creator's prerogatives. So some people regarded it as a satanic project. Others regarded it as simple foolishness and craziness and hokum and, hopelessness, and found it to be a matter of high comedy. So I think there was any number of different reactions, but from skepticism to horror. And even within, by this time, I must say that John Murray Spear had, by his actions, had distanced himself from what you might call a more level-headed, or depending on your point of view, more conventionally bound members of the reform community. He was a very leading member of various reform organizations and movements, but once he started producing these projects, everybody started to look the other way and pretend that they didn't know the guy, which is really why, he didn't show up. He's not, taught in grade schools like William Lloyd Garrison is, or, along the names of the famous. All the reform movement histories just wrote this guy out because he was an embarrassment.
At a certain point, a mob came for the new motor.
Yeah, and that's variously described. John himself, I think, probably in order to dramatize it, described it as a mob. This was while the machine had been reassembled in Randolph, New York, in the barn. They came one night and smashed it, but there's some question about that. I mean, obviously, John is thinking about the mob that attacked him earlier in his career, and the mob that also there was a famous incident where a mob came in and destroyed a printing press of an abolitionist and beat the guy up. I forget his name now. But these were the images that were going through his head when he was describing what this mob had done and the size and extent of the damage. In fact, the other newspaper reports described it as a small group of young men who were out to play a prank and maybe disassembled it or beat it with plows or so. I don't know what they did to it. In any event, it was an opportunity for John to turn his attention, I think, away from the sort of day-by-day necessity to get the thing running. It just wouldn't run. And
right, because that kind of brought the end of the physical machine part of the new motive project. Yes. Although he did also invent in his own mind potential applications for the machine when it became operative. These including powering boats and other sort of applications for it. But yes, that project was more or less shelved at that point. Although Crosby Hewitt, who was his mechanic for that, had built a small model of it, and he took it around from time to time and showed it off at conventions of reformers and lectures, and gave lectures about it, using the model to give people an idea about it. So I think it's safe to say that there might be parts of the original new motor out there somewhere scattered about, but it's possible that Crosby Hewitt's completed model of it, and I don't know how big this thing was, maybe a foot in cubic foot or something. I imagine he had to carry it from lecture to lecture. That might still be around somewhere. I don't know. Well, that's interesting you say that, John, because there's somebody on the internet who does claim that they have found the new motive. And it's small like that, and it has John Murray's spear engraved in it. I don't know if it's a hoax. I actually reached out to them. I don't know if it's a hoax or not. They never replied to me, but, you do read interesting things like that online. I read one conspiracy theory that said that it was never that John made up the mob basically so he could rebuild the new motor in another place, and it's still growing and becoming the powerful messiah it's meant to be,
Oh, yeah. And it's now powering our very world.
Yes. I believe it. I believe it. It's at Area 51.
Yeah,
and
right. Somewhere in a Air Force base in New Mexico.
Yeah, it's over there. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, all that. Well, I see. Yeah, I saw the story about this guy with the John Murray Spear engraved machine, and I just, you want my opinion? It's a big hoax, but I mean, it's a big joke.
So do you think it just got disassembled and they basically just
turn their attention elsewhere? They couldn't get the thing running, and then some rowdies broke in one night, probably drunk, and beat on it, and they didn't bother to redo it.
They start believing that one of the reasons the new motor may not be taking off is that the world isn't ready for it yet. And so they start trying to build a new society. And it kind of... can you talk about that society for the new man? And I think true marriage versus false marriage is part of that. The free love movement. One
of the old things, the mechanical things, nearly mechanical things, that was binding the world to matter, as you might say, and chaining the spirit, was the institution of marriage, according to a lot of reformers at that time. And so they were influenced by earlier French ideas, particularly by this French socialist named Charles Fourier, who wished to release the natural affinities, as he called, that existed between people, something like electrical energies or vibratory frequencies or something like that, by which people would be freely bound together, like magnetized together. And they conceived that these free associations that would be ideal were being hindered by these merely human arrangements, contracts called marriage. So it was thought that the improvement of the human race would come when we could abolish traditional marriage and allow people to procreate according to their natural affinities. So that was the doctrine of free love. So in order to have that happen, you needed to create a society, a small society perhaps at first, where people could follow their leanings in this regard. And John had leanings, and his followers had leanings. And John pursued those leanings with one of his followers named Caroline Hinckley. And the result of pursuing those leanings was that Caroline Hinckley, who was not married to John in the traditional sense, he still had a wife and children in Boston, had gone out to establish a community in northern New York at a place called Kyantown, which is just south of Jamestown, and had set up a commune there. And that was to be this new experimental utopian community. And Caroline gave birth to a boy, as the paper said, a bouncing, non-spiritual infant of 9 pounds or something. And of course, there was a huge scandal to everybody back in Boston and elsewhere. But this was supposed to have been created by the higher spiritual affinities that by which humans should decide, who should mate, and according to those ideal matings, produce a better human being than we had. So this is kind of like the next step for the new motive power is. Yeah, it was the notion of creating this community in which the human race would evolve into something brand new was all of a piece with the expectations around the new motor.
And what was the cavity project at Key and Tone?
Well, John's spirits, since there were so many, in all these different associations and committees, were just feeding him all kinds of projects to do. One of them was to pursue the discovery and uncovering of a mythical, to us, civilization that had been centered, lo and behold, just below the territory of this commune that they'd set up in Kyanton. So he started digging, and there were some expectations about, is this sort of what we would call an archaeological dig, or what was going on? What was down there? The remains of a highly technologically developed society, or maybe even speculation that, hey, there was some underground cavity down there where these people had been driven to and were still down there. And they would somehow, when we broke through, we could find and come in contact with this advanced civilization down there. So again, like with the new motor, these ideas were not well developed, but kind of developed first in people's imaginations and speculations about what it was that they were doing. They were being clearly directed to dig this cavity, and they were told that this was in order to find this ancient civilization. But what it was that they were going to be finding, nobody was really quite sure about, and they were kind of waiting to see what would turn up. In any event, one of the followers was extremely rich. Well, two of them were extremely rich and funded this elaborate excavation, digging a tunnel that you could walk down into, hundreds of feet into the ground, in order to make contact. And the thing was, as I said, down a couple of hundred feet, I think, and then started to fill up with water. And it's not surprising because there are a lot of underground springs in the region. So they installed pumps and tried to keep going, but nothing ever happened. And finally they were defeated by the water and couldn't continue it. That cavity, that tunnel, I think it's still there, although it's on private property and some farm, and has been boarded up. And I don't think the owner, from what I can tell, is particularly keen on having people
go into this. Because somebody died in the tunnel. Well, yeah, that seems very not safe. Very not good to let people.
Yeah, I think it's been mapped. I think it's been found lately, some kind of project to map the area geologically, but I don't think people really go down there. I've never been down there.
So all these projects are kind of all in service of the same kind of idea, though, of like creating this new society where people can basically be free to do what they want, and gives them that peace and freedom, right? That's kind of what all of these...
Sounds good, doesn't it?
Yeah, it sounds great. Good. Wish they had done it. Sounds awesome.
Let's do it.
Yeah. I'm in. So then...
I don't know where it is. That perfect society may be up in the clouds of the afterlife, or maybe under the ground in the center of the earth, or somewhere. But it's not here. It's not here where I am right now. So let's get up an expedition and get to it.
But so eventually, I know you mentioned that the new motor he had ideas for other things. eventually the new motor kind of morphs into an automatic sewing machine?
Well, before we get to the sewing machine, there was one other project that had to do with this, the importance of sexual congress between people who were regarded as spiritual affinities. They would gain, it was thought, this mediumistic power to transmit thoughts, to read each other, clairvoyance and all of this. Based on this notion, the spirits described to John a project where a male and female medium would be together in some fashion or another in a room at the base of a tower. And the tower, I don't know nobody knows what these towers really would look like, but in my imagination, I've thought of them as sort of like a giant obelisk, maybe with, mystic symbols carved on the side or something, I'm not sure. And then down in the operating room, the mediums, uniformed mediums maybe, would be entranced, maybe through sexual activity, I'm not sure, but in any event, they'd be entranced, and they could transmit through this amplification that was afforded by the towers. They could transmit thoughts to other towers that had been built around the region. And so it would form a sort of microwave network. I don't know how to, you have to think.
It's like a telegraph network. It's like a telephone company, but
it's not just one-to-one transmission here.
Okay.
From one point to another. See, this is an advance. This is more like, what we've got now with microwave towers.
Yeah, sure.
There was a network, and it was going to compete with the underground cables, the submarine cables across the Atlantic, and those were bad, apparently, according to the spirits, because they were owned by monopolies, and it was going to cost a lot of money to send messages, and so it wouldn't serve the general people's purpose. But here, your mediumistic network would become the people at people's service, presumably free. I don't know how, but would transmit messages all over the country. It would become the center of the world's communications network. This little farm up in Randolph, but this was all notional. I think they ever.
Yeah, they never did. They do anything to implement this?
No, I don't think so. There's no evidence that any of this was ever even begun.
When they were, because my question is,
it would have taken.
Well, it's like, would they use the same kind of like weird mechanical suit that John used to try to?
Yeah, I don't know, but I do know this: that John did do what he called experiments with clairvoyant thought transmission. And it probably involved sexual intercourse to ramp up the powers and your...
a lot of his ideas involve sexual intercourse.
Sensitivity.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, you can see how this is going.
Yeah. I mean,
he was a male like any other male, and so his thoughts often turned to the fairy sex.
And I'm sure that for the time in the 19th century, that's I mean, even for now, his ideas would be very far out there. For the 19th century,
yeah.
The free love.
Right. This is you're describing my brain melting when I first read about these projects in these old books. How could this be happening? This is like some eruption of the Buck Rogers of the 25th century into 19th century America.
Yeah. Do you have any idea of why this kind of movement may have been springing up kind of in direct opposition to a lot of the mainstream ideals at the time.
Talk more about that.
I just find it very interesting that it's the free love movement especially just seems so diametrically opposed to at least our idea of what the 19th century was today. And I was wondering, it was obviously a time of major unrest. A lot of this kind of takes place before, during, and after the Civil War. Does that have anything to do with...
I don't know if the Civil War did it in itself, but there was a lot of talk about reforming marriage. And
right, because it kind of went hand in hand with the abolitionism and the death penalty, and he also didn't believe in prison. One thing I don't think we talked much about earlier was he didn't believe in prisons. Correct? He wanted people to... Yeah.
Well, you know what? In his brother Charles's diary, he one day, Charles was like his brother, but not quite so much the same way. But I think it's reflective of the way people's standard operating procedure was, at least among the reformers, was daily expectations about what next, where will I be led next. Man, I'm surprised that my views on this have changed so much. Now I don't believe, in the death penalty, but tomorrow I'm beginning to think, hey, I'll probably be led into thinking nobody should even be imprisoned, that it's impossible to justify one human being imprisoning another. So,
right, and much like these projects, it's kind of this, once you take one step, they never take the step back. They kind of always keep moving forward, and so once you're past that point, and once you give into one belief, it becomes a lot easier to then buy into the next thing that maybe to somebody in mainstream thought is super radical, but for you, it's just a little more extreme.
One further step. Yeah. The logic is leading me in this direction. I don't know where I'll be tomorrow, but I may be even further along in this thread.
And part of it, too, is John, particularly believes that a lot of his life is being led through some purpose, not just of his own wants and needs. He believes he's following to some kind of destiny.
Yeah. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
He did not...
It is amazing.
Necessarily question it, although there are hints that he may have been playing his followers in some sense, at least massaging them so that, they provided him with support and funding for these projects and so on. So it's hard to look deeply down into him, but he was certainly unique in this regard, that he took his visions, what we would call dreams or even fevered dreams, to be real enough that he believed in them enough to actually go out and try to build them, to construct them. That step was what made him seem insane to people who weren't among his followers.
And I guess that leads us back to the sewing machine. How does the new motive power become a sewing machine? Because that, when I read your book, I gotta be honest with you, that got me laughing, because it just seemed like such a huge change from like such a commonplace thing is kind of given birth from this miraculous idea.
That's a nice point. That's a nice point. It does have that aspect to it, doesn't it? And I don't mean to speak against that, because I think it's true, and I laugh as well when I think about it. However, our understanding of what a sewing machine was is a little different, or the importance of it is a little different from what how it was understood in those days. It was a new invention, and it was thought to radically change the domestic life. It would free women from laborious hand sewing. It would, and so that was one huge change, because women spent a lot of time sewing. And it would also change other things around that, about the way the family was organized. They could take in work and be contract workers and still stay at home, for example. So that was they could be involved in the money economy. There was a lot of things that came together in why the sewing machine, the invention of the sewing machine, was important to domestic life. And of course, John was a huge advocate of women's rights and freeing women from the bondage of domestic slavery, et cetera, et cetera. So in one sense, it was a continuation of this, right? It was a machine that would free women from domestic slavery. And so it was an important invention. Also, it could make some money for the group. So that's not to be denied. So they decided to try to put together a machine that would be cheap, and so would be affordable to many women. That was important, the democratic ideal. And so it would be the people's machine, and that would somehow work despite the fact that nobody knew how to build a machine except with the patents that you had to license from a couple of combines. Singer and Howe had sort of cornered these fundamental patents on the machine. And ordinarily, people who made different brands of machines had to license the rights from them, and thus the price of these machines were prohibitive for most folks. So the idea was to reinvent a sewing machine that would bypass those patent rights. So the way they did it, of course, was through visionary work. I don't know how to describe this except to say that they tried to get visions and dreams that would suggest to them different ways of constructing the mechanism that they needed to make a sewing machine. And by that time, they had moved into a second spot that they had acquired along the Ohio River. And a lot of this experimentation to try to build this machine was conducted there. But it was, again, this being John Murray Spear, it's not like, hey, here's a workshop, let's go to work and try to think of something. It was first go into a trance and then have sexual intercourse, then have a dream where something would come to you based on these powers that these spirits, spirits with affinity to the project would visit you and give you ideas. So they developed what looked like, again, we're dealing with instructions and descriptions that have all the ambiguity of what you would expect out of the middle of the 19th century, but fragmentary descriptions of something that looks like each person being assigned or consecrated to the name of a different mechanical function of the machine. So one was called a needleist, and for example, and then they did some kind of improvised ritual or dance where all the parts would interact, and to do some basic functions as if they were doing the functions of sewing. And then they would retire to a room next door and where they would go to sleep. And then hopefully have some vision, awake with some kind of vision in the morning about how to, build a machine piece by piece in the way they had done the new motor project, but it would be a new sewing machine.
Was the sewing machine ever completed?
One can only imagine. Yes, somehow they produced a machine. I get the impression that it wasn't a great one, but it wasn't all that expensive. And I don't know. I don't know anybody that's got a model of it. If I had spent the last 20 years looking for one, I might have been able to retrieve one. They did sell a few. I don't know. They tried to send an agent to Europe and at least to England and open up a showroom there. I don't know whether or not they sold much of anything, anything. I don't know if they stole patents. I don't know how they rigged the thing, but they did produce a machine.
Right. So you mentioned they go to Europe, starting to wind things down a little bit. John Murray, he goes to Europe for a little bit. Can you kind of talk about him leaving spiritualism, how he fell out of love with it, I guess, and then just the end of his life and how he spent the rest of his days after all these inventions?
Well, I tend to think that he was constantly enlivened by these visions he had. But, of course, he found obstacles in the way to making them real. And some of them are not only obstacles in the way that the natural world really works, but also maybe disappointment among his followers and opposition, mocking, and so on. And he eventually decided, or was told by his spirit friends, that he could retire more or less and transfer his responsibilities to someone else, which he did around 1872, I think. And after that, he continued to be a medium, but not really the public figure that he thought of himself as and that actually had been. But he still continued in participating in reform movements, organizing peace societies and attending spiritualist conventions and so on. But really, he ramped down his own activities. But he still was, by that time, he was like, I don't know, if he would appear at one of these conventions, his earlier eccentricities were softened around the edges, at least in people's memories. And he was just more or less treated as the grand old man and reformer. Usually his mechanical visionary projects were forgotten or put aside, and he was remembered for his prison reform work, or his position in the abolitionist movement. He was still welcomed as a medium at spiritualism conventions and so on, but he wasn't publicly active anymore.
Right, and when did he pass away?
My memory is 1887 or 88.
And how was he kind of remembered by everybody once he passed away?
Yeah. He had been, by that time, he'd been really essentially written out of all the histories of the reform movements, not surprisingly. So you don't ever hear of him anymore until, I decided to write this book. I mean, it's not entirely true, but his life wasn't put together as a whole for a long time, and he appeared only in if you really dug out stuff and looked for him. There was one very famous book called Modern American Spiritualism, written by a spiritualist who was John's contemporary. Emma Hardinge, Britain, and it's so chock full of details that it's usually been used as a source book for historians for a long time since then. And she was quite negative about John and his various projects. And so she did spend quite a bit of time talking about him in bits and pieces, and reported first on the New Motive Project, quoting a lot of the descriptions of the time. But she was very much repelled, or at least she said she was, by his free love activities and by the sheer eccentricity of these physical projects that he was trying to do. So even she didn't really treat the subject well. But it was in her book that I first ran across him. And when I read about him, I just couldn't believe what I was reading.
Because he was even kind of on the mainstream of, on the fringes of even spiritualism. Like what you're saying is she seemed like a pretty, in terms of how mainstream spiritualism was, she seemed like a pretty mainstream leader of the spiritualist movement.
Well, yeah, at the beginning, spiritualists are trying to get spiritualists together. Is, as the proverb says, like herding cats. They're all individualists. They've all got their own individual visions and so on. So they didn't really organize for a long time. And part of the division, one of the big divisions among spiritualists was, well, is this really true to Christianity, or is it a refutation of Christianity? So there were Christian spiritualists and atheist spiritualists, or whatever category you want to say. But certainly one of the pictures that many spiritualists tried to portray to the outside world was, look, this doesn't question tradition, society, traditional beliefs, and so on. It simply fulfills your longing for reassurance that there's an afterlife and that your dear departed ones are still with us in a way and still alive. And it doesn't, because of that, there was real reluctance by many people to either broadcast to the world or even to admit to themselves that spiritualism was an open-ended visionary project that, could undermine all kinds of things. And Emma Hardinge Britain was one of those who put on a happy face, as it were, for the outside world and portrayed spiritualism as just an unadulterated, pure blessing to the human race. And you can see why she treated Spear's projects and ideas so, dreadfully in a way.
Yes, those two ideas do not gel at all. Well, at all. Well, John, I'm kind of at the end, so do you have any final thoughts? Anything you'd like to say to kind of summarize things?
Oh, I wish I did, but I think you've drained me here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, John, thank you so much.
Your project.
This has been great.
I look forward to hearing what you make of it.
Do you know of any other steampunk inventions that were real? Let us know on our Twitter and Instagram at strange_phenom and on Facebook at Strange Phenomenon, all one word. Please give us a review and subscribe on your favorite podcasting app. Visit www.strange-phenomenon.com for a full list of sources and more episodes. Strange Phenomenon is hosted by Ray Tarara. It's written and produced by RJ Blake and Ray Tarara. Theme music by Tara Monk. Additional music provided by Sergei Cheremizanov.